Missy, if you could call the roll.
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Chase?
Here.
Ms. Duku is absent. Ms. Guy?
Here.
Ms. Halstead?
Here.
Ms. Healy?
Here.
Ms. Odedegon is absent. Ms. Randall?
Here.
Ms. Sigmund?
Here.
And Dr. Warner?
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. And we do not need to approve anyone to participate electronically. Can I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
We're going to click. So, I was going to say, yes, it's unanimous vote, so. How long has it been? Just today, just today. With that, we have a presentation on the approval of a revised fiscal year 25 school board funding request.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As Mr. Fulmer's coming up to give just a couple slide update as to the things that we've learned, it's my pleasure to bring to the board for consideration today an updated funding request that fulfills some of our hopes from the General Assembly. And Mr. Fulmer's going to run through that, and then we'll certainly take some questions and encourage the board to consider a readoption of its fiscal 25 budget.
All right, good afternoon, School Board Chair, Vice Chair, and other members of the board. Quick update on just where we were a couple of weeks ago. Ultimately, we approved a budget of $457.2 million, and that was with adding the $3.8 million in for the service scale phase 1 into our discretionary expenses for compensation. With that, it increased our local funding request to $18.8 million, had $23.8 million in state funding increase for a total of $457.2 to balance the budget. Since then, shortly after that, started to get more information from the House and the Senate down in the General Assembly in Richmond. Ultimately, the preliminary numbers coming from the Senate showed a $15.7 million increase for Stafford schools, Stafford County Public Schools. The House showed $6.2 million. Some common kind of drivers on both sides there, and then some unique ones. The biggest increase on both sides were they are adding funding for compensation in both their budgets. It's a good sign that they're pretty close, 3% and 3.375 in both the House and the Senate. So that ultimately, we feel pretty comfortable that that's going to land when they come up together and settle on a budget. Both of them with increasing or doing a 3% compensation, removed the 1% bonus that we were applying towards compensation. It was just a small amount. They didn't get us very far. They both added additional funds for at-risk students. They also both addressed English language learners and some different models there. One was a little bit more than the other, a little bit more drastic than the other. The big difference in the Senate compared to the House is they had a complete removal of the support cap, which was several $1 million in our favor. Also, the breakfast funds reimbursement, very minor. That's not the free lunch for all that had received some publicity. That's not in this budget yet, but it's just an additional reimbursement for breakfast. That ultimately falls into our school nutrition fund. It wouldn't actually hit our operating fund, but it was a small amount of the 15.7. And then there were other minor technical adjustments across the board. Ultimately, as I mentioned, 15.7 for the Senate and 6.2 for the House. Based on historical experience and what we're hearing from Richmond, is we think we're going to land above even that 6.2. We're going to land somewhere in the middle of the House and the Senate. But what that means is we feel pretty comfortable that we can go ahead and add additional funds now into our budget and assume we're getting those additional funds from the state. So what we want to do is reduce the $3.8 million that we asked for in our local ask a couple weeks ago, put that into the additional state aid, plus the 2.7 additional to finish the Phase 3 of the teacher scale. So it's a $6.5 million total increase in state funds, but it gets our local fund ask back down to $15 million, which aligns to the county administrator's budget. And so what we do with that additional 6.5, as I mentioned, part of it was already built into your budget, which was for Phase 1 of the service scale enhancements. And then we also want to add in we had done a modified Phase 3, if you remember, for our teacher scale because we couldn't afford the full portion. So we want to add that back in, and what that does is increase the base of the teacher scale up by $500, but it has a cascading kind of ripple effect all the way down. But it brings up our average teacher increase from a little over 5% to about 6.5%. And our service scales across the board, we'll see about an 8.7% increase. As I mentioned, starting salary for teachers, increasing it to $50,500. Service scale, Phase 1. This is the most significant investment we have in the service scale as far as the 5 phases, because this is the first year we have to correct and get everybody on the proper step. So historically, if you recall, a few years ago, it's been at least 3 budget cycles now, we started doing some placement of service scale employees, but we capped it at the midpoint, and it was only about 2.5% for each year of experience and how we were calculating years of experience. To be fair, or to be honest, wasn't the most fair. It was what we could afford, so it was kind of like a 1 to 3 model for outside of experience, so we're adjusting a more of a 1 to 1 if it's a direct like experience, and if it's a similar experience, be a 1 to 2. And so what you see there is our support staff, it's actually an average of about 12%. When you assume in our administrative staff or exempt staff, so principals, APs, et cetera, adjusting them, because right now they're at a 3% flat in the budget, adjusting that to a 5% flat, which is still kind of short of what we're seeing across the region and across the street. But adjusting that up, it brings up the total average for all support staff to 8.7%. Additionally, because we adjusted our our teacher scale up slightly, that actually has a small impact on our paraprofessional scale. So we need to adjust our paraprofessional scale because, as you recall, we're tying our paraprofessional scale as a percentage of our teacher scale, depending on the level of that paraprofessional and what they're asked to do. So as our teacher scale goes up, our para scale will go up, which is great because we'll never kind of fall really far behind on our paraprofessional scale. So we see a small adjustment there as well. But what we see is our paraprofessionals overall see a 12.5% increase. So kind of by far the largest increase of the group, on par with the service staff. So key upcoming dates. We're about a day away from each chamber to consider the other chambers' budget bill and revenue bills. And then March 9th, we'll see that kind of dismissal of the General Assembly. Hopefully we have a lot more information between March 28th and March 9th. April 2nd, the Board of Supervisors adopts their tax rate and approves the budget, which is a little bit earlier than previous years. Gives us more time to adopt our final budget with whatever tweaks we have to make and get contracts out as soon as possible. Any questions?
Does anyone have any questions? Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chris, when you were talking about the Senate revenue side, and you mentioned additional at-risk add-on funds, how is that done? Is that like a ratio of at-risk students to teachers, or is that a flat sum, or what is that?
It's just a basic aid dollar amount that's added based on number of students.
Can I just ask you to clarify for the folks listening on the April 17 date, the reconvene veto session? Can you talk a little bit, just explain to people what that means in terms of any impact it has on our budget, how that looks? Any hopes that might be dashed that day? No, can you just explain what that means? Because it says vetoed, and I feel like that word means a negative. So just to
I
explain to
can
them
cover
what
that.
happens, yeah, just for the record.
So when the General Assembly concludes and bills are submitted to the governor's desk for signature, the overwhelming majority of them typically get signed because it's the people's representatives that have spoken. But occasionally, a bill might be vetoed by the executive, and then it will go back to the General Assembly to gain a supermajority's worth of support to override that veto. And so the General Assembly will come back together and either negotiate with the executive, or they will get a supermajority in order to override that veto. So last year's budget process was a good example of none of the adults in Richmond could get along. And the governor did veto the legislature's changes, and they had, the state Senate was in conflict with the House and the governor's office as a result of the budget. And so it drug out a very long and protracted budget process that did not conclude until the fall. And that is very possible that that could happen again. So it is something that we watch. It is something that we monitor. It's our hope that the decision makers and lawmakers in Richmond come to an amicable solution and that they work together.
Can I also just use this as a moment to remind the public that your voices always matter and shouldn't stop at any point during the process, because we do have this one moment in time where, so I think it's always important to continue to voice your support for education to your delegates, to your senators, to let them know that you're greatly watching every move that they make in the budget and funding realm.
Any additional questions? Sure, Dr. Chase.
And I want to add on, in agreement with Ms. Halstead, to not forget the governor. The person who has the veto power should also be contacted. So on your calendar there, you have the folks across the street adopting their tax rate. So this is a reassessment year, so we've all gotten our letters from our county telling us how much our property value has increased. And one of the things the supervisors are considering is equalizing the tax rate. So if they equalize the tax rate, there still will be more money in their budget, but they'll have to figure out how they want to spend that money. So what kinds of effects could that have on the money that the schools see? Because we're asking for this money, but we're also asking for CIP money and things like that. So what kinds of effects could that have?
Fairly significant, and I will say that I've got one add-on to your comments. Not everyone got a tax reassessment notice because not everybody in Stafford is a homeowner. And so changes to their tax bill may also be reflected in increased rents or changes to rents as a result of that, whether or not their taxes go up or not. And so that is a dynamic that we are also working with in our community. I think it all will depend on how the Board of Supervisors chooses to prioritize the money that they have and how they will balance that. Obviously, they could still reduce their taxes based on the growth in revenue and still fully fund the school system if they wanted to, based on how they prioritize things. So watching their budget discussions and deliberations would be very important because they could determine a lot for us. For us, our discretionary budget is compensation. So what's at stake is compensation. And if they do a reduction to the school system's budget in any way, it will impact compensation.
Thank you.
Dr. Warner?
This has always been, I think, confusing to the residents. So when the tax rate is equalized, there's a net zero. It's to compensate for the increase in the assessed values. The budget that Mr. Vosberg proposed, what is the tax rate set at for that?
Oh, gosh.
I think it's 94.
Yeah, well, I think that's what it is right now, but I think he is actually proposing
I thought it
a
was
reduction to 91 cents. The current rate is, I believe, 94, and he is proposing a reduction to 91, but if they were to equalize, I think it would be 84 cents. So that would be a fairly significant, and for those who are struggling to understand what an equalized tax rate is, It's to not increase the county's revenue and to adjust how much they charge the taxpayers in terms of their rate per $100 of value or assessed value, so that the county's budget is flat and the taxpayer doesn't pay any additional money. Now, of course, the rub with this is that residents who have raising property values do get the benefit of having increased property values, but it's getting the benefit without the added responsibility of having to pay for infrastructure, having to pay for schools, having to pay for public safety. So, you know, obviously there's a delicate balance there. I think, unfortunately for Stafford, we have a little bit of a history of lowering a rate, then having to raise it again, then going right back to lowering it when we do an assessment, and then raising it again. And that yo-yoing effect doesn't really provide a whole lot of stability to our community either.
Thank you. I just wanted to tell people to, if you're going to talk to the Board of Supervisors, the best thing might be to advocate for not equalizing that rate, which would be about 85 cents. That will really prevent them from funding even at the level that they've suggested they would.
Ms. Ely?
You know, I have a concern when the Board of Supervisors steps into what I think is our lane, and I think part of this discussion is their lane. I mean, it's their responsibility and their prerogative to deal with the tax rate. And we can make comments, but anything we say is just our opinion. So I just want to make clear that, you know, when we speak here, we're speaking individually and not, you know, as a board. Unless we direct our chair to make a statement, then these are individuals. Because, I mean, I've probably been here, Ms. Randalls, you've been a resident longer than I have, but yeah, I moved here in '85, so I've seen a lot of changes, you know, in the county and the county government and the tax collection as well. But I would not presume to step into their shoes to be talking about, you know, where that tax rate is going to be. They're going to be listening to the citizens when they come in, you know, and they're going to be listening to their departments. They're certainly, hopefully going to be, no, not hopefully, I expect they're going to be listening to us in just, you know, less than an hour when we're making our budget presentation. So I just want to keep this all in perspective. When we talk about the tax rate and the budgets, you know, that is the purview of another element of the county government. And we're responsible for the schools, we're responsible for requesting and advocating for a budget that meets our needs. But ultimately, you know, we will be adopting a budget within whatever funding is available from the state and the county government.
I actually would like to circle back around to the presentation. I had a question about slide 7. Thank you for putting numbers on it. Service scale, you indicated this is the first phase and it's the most significant investment year because it is the first step. Can you remind me if one of the steps will tie them to teacher scale like para and where that is in our step journey for service?
So it won't tie them based on what the teacher scale is, but we're trying to match the model of the teacher
Okay.
scale. So there is a step scale in place with equal percentages between each step in a phased approach like we have for teachers.
It is definitely our design that over time, we should be trying to tie all the positions to the teacher scale in some way, shape, or form vis-a-vis a percentage, so that we don't ever find ourselves in the situation where we have to pit one employee group over another for raises, that everybody goes up, and unfortunately, there are times that are lean and they stay the same, or God forbid, they have to go down. It's all done together.
That makes sense. Are there any additional questions about the presentation?
Madam Chair, I move to approve the amended school budget.
Second.
Okay. I've been informed we have some technological difficulties. We've been asked to do a voice vote. So all in favor of approving the budget as presented?
Aye.
Any opposed? That's it. With nothing left on our agenda, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Fulmer, for
To meet the students that are